Welcome back. What we're going to look at in this installment is how we can expose the ability to set some options or some settings for our application to the end user. So let's think about the way TweetScan works. Right now, every time you run the app from the start screen, we're going to use the Windows 8 hashtag as your default search. Now, obviously, if you do it from the search pane, we'll grab the query text like we saw in one of the previous episodes. But by default, when you launch from the start page, we always look for Windows 8. And as a user, I may want to change that. I may not always want Windows 8 to be it. I would like to have a different default query. So what we're going to do is add some settings. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. We're going to go ahead and just run TweetScan right out of the box the way we have it running now. And if I bring up the charms bar, you'll see that there's this thing called a settings charm. And inside of that, when I click it, is the settings pane. And I can actually go in and add, as the developer, additional categories of settings. The only one you get by default is permissions, which just kind of shows you, what does the app do. But we would like to add additional settings. This will be kind of a common convention across all WinRT applications, all Windows Store applications. I'll be able, and I want to be able to update that with some settings for my application. So let's see how we would do that. What I've done is I have added in the project already ahead of time a settings folder. You can call this anything you want, it doesn't have to be settings. And inside that you can have multiple HTML pages that represent the different categories of settings you may have. We're just going to have one, but you could have multiple. What I do is in the div, the root div of the HTML, is I set that to a WinJS control of WinJS UI.settings flyout. I can control its width. You really have two choices, narrow and wide. The one we looked at was narrow, but you can kind of almost double the size with kind of a wide setting. But we'll just use the narrow one for now. I go ahead and give it a label here, preferences, which will be the title of the flyout. And then I just have a very simple setup here where I've just got a header here that says, here's my default search tag, text box for input that I'm going to call tag, and then a button that allows the user to save the new tag. Okay, real straightforward. Now I associate some JavaScript with this. And if we look at what happens here, this gets a little interesting. We'll see that I go and I look in this thing called roaming settings. And let's just back up and walk through what our options are here real quickly. If all I care about is saving the settings on my machine and my machine only, I can use something called local settings. And this allows me to store some settings onto this machine. They only exist on this machine. And this is just basically like a dictionary, a property bag of settings. What I can also do, though, is if you think about this scenario, that I may run TweetScan on my desktop, I may have your app TweetScan installed on my laptop, and I may also have it on like my Slate device. And it would be really nice that if I were to set my default search tag to something other than Windows 8, that default search tag would be available to me, that configuration, that setting would replicate to all of the different places I use your app. And so I can use something called roaming settings. And this means that what we'll do is we'll take this tag, take the value called tag, and replicate it into the cloud. And any place that I, as the end user, with my live ID, uses your application, we'll actually be able to pull that setting down. So now whatever my default tag is, it'll be the same on my desktop, my laptop, and my Slate device. Now here we're just using a property bag. You can, as you can see, I've also got local folders. So if I have a little bit larger data, I want to serialize something to a file, I can do that locally. Or I can do the same thing and replicate things into the cloud with a roaming folder. Now, that's just like a regular folder in the file system. You can do whatever you want with it. Now, you are limited to 100K. You have 100 kilobytes that you can push into the cloud. If you go over 100K, we'll actually stop replicating. So this is not really a big data replication scheme. This is more about, nuggets of data that are important, settings, configuration, maybe some in-state data, something like that, right? Lightweight, light touch. So what I do here is when you open up this page, I go out into the cloud and I say, is there a tag value? If there is not a tag value, it means it's the very first time you have ever run this app anywhere. So I'll just go ahead and say, well, your default tag should be Windows 8. I'll populate that into HTML page, our preferences, and then I wire up the event handle that says, hey, if you click save, then we'll go ahead and push out the new value out there into roaming settings, okay? Now, what we need to do is update our home.js here to not use the hard-coded Windows 8. So the very first time you come in, or any time you come in actually, what we'll do is we'll go in and go into Windows Storage, get application data, grab the current values there, the current data, and go and get our roaming settings, and go and look for the tag value. And just like we did before, if and I could probably clean this code up to be a little bit better, but you guys get the idea. Then if it is undefined, we'll just fall back to that default of Windows 8, right? So that's great. We've got our default set up. We've got the settings showing up. Now, how do we get the settings pane to actually show up when you click the settings charm? Well, the way we do that is we go into default.js. And we're going to come down here after we've processed everything from a UI perspective, and we're going to go into Win.js, application, and we're going to wire into the onSettings event. And this is essentially gets called when someone clicks the settings charm and the settings pane opens for us. We're going to handle this event. And you can add multiple settings in here if you want. You can go look at the samples in the SDK to see how to do more complex things. But I just want to kind of give you a feel for what we're working with here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and grab this thing called application commands from the argument detail that's passed into us. And we're going to create an object. And inside this object, we create one or more entries. And we give each entry its own name. So we're going to call this particular entry preferences. And then each entry essentially is another object. And what we're going to do is set two properties. The first one is we're going to set the title. And this is what would show up in the settings pane as the list of settings that I can choose from. So we're going to say, hey, here's where you set your preferences. And then I set up an href property. And what the href property does is it tells us, or tells Windows, well, where do I find the settings page for this particular entry? And so we're going to say you're going to go to preferences.html, just like that. All right, so we say preferences, go grab this page. Then all I need to do, once I have that, is I'm going to go to Win.js. I'm going to go into the UI. I'm going to grab the settings flyout. That's the pane that opens up for us. I'm going to say, hey, you need to populate some settings. Here's what I want you to populate it with. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. Just real quick, I went back and took a little break and changed this. When I typed this in the first time, it said defined. I forgot to say undefined, so I fixed that. So let's just go ahead and run this. So there's my default Windows 8. Looks good. Bring up the charms bar, click in settings. There's preferences now. When I click that, now you would want to brand this, right? This is just kind of the default experience. If I had put some branding on here, I had a blue background or whatever, I'm going to want to make this match my application. But there's my default search tag. So let's say now, it's football season, so let's follow the Spartans. That's what I want to have as my default tag. So we go ahead and save that now. Leave the settings pane. We'll go back into the app and stop debugging it. Let's launch it again. And now you can see I'm searching for my Spartans. All right, so that's how you can use both settings and kind of an introduction to the settings pane, roaming settings. Again, I can do this locally. And again, I can now go to my Slate device, run tweet scan, and it would pull Spartans down from the cloud as my default search. We'll dig into some of these topics in more detail in future screencasts, but hopefully that gets you started with the right way to handle settings and exposing those settings to your user from within a Windows Store application.